There is a particular cruelty reserved for women who refuse to be small. The world does not strike them. It simply decides they are too loud, too clever, too full of some ungovernable fire, and then it puts them out into the cold like a spent candle and calls the act a mercy. When Sidonie Larke was thrown from her aunt's door before the sun had climbed over the fells, still wearing the crumpled gown she had shamed the family in the night before, it was meant to be the quiet end of her. She had spoken when she ought to have held her tongue. She had seen what she was meant to pretend she could not see. She was to disappear into some grey obscurity, a cautionary tale murmured over teacups by women who had never once been brave. Instead, that very night, a black carriage bearing the crest of the most feared man in the north came grinding up the frozen lane. And the Duke of Wrenhaven did not come to demand an apology. He came with a marriage contract. The morning they cast her out, the frost lay so thick on the windows of Harrowden Grange that the glass looked blind. Sidonie was woken not by a maid, but by the flat, deliberate rap of her aunt's knuckle against the door, and she knew before she opened her eyes that the reckoning she had earned the previous night had arrived on schedule. Lady Vane did not enter the little attic room. She stood in the corridor with a candle held before her, and the small flame turned her powdered face into something carved and cold. She was a handsome woman still, at 47, in the way that hard weather is handsome. Behind her, half hidden in the gloom, hovered her two daughters. Petronella, the elder, had wrapped herself in a shawl and worn an expression of exquisite sorrow, though her eyes glittered with something closer to triumph. Maud, the younger, simply looked frightened, the way she always looked when her mother's temper filled a room like smoke. "Dress," said Lady Vane. Her voice was very even. That was how Sidonie knew the matter was already decided. Her aunt only shouted over things that might yet go her way. Sidonie sat up. The cold of the room bit through the thin nightgown at once, and she pressed her arms across her chest. "Where am I going, Aunt?" "Anywhere," said Lady Vane. "That is not under this roof." There it was. Sidonie had expected it, had lain awake half the night expecting it, and still the word landed in her stomach like a swallowed stone. She was 23. She had lived beneath her aunt's charity for 11 years, since the winter her father died with his name in ruins, and had learned exactly how much silence a roof was worth. She had simply never been able to keep still long enough to pay the price. "You will want to say," Lady Vane continued, "that it was unjust, that you were only telling the truth. I have heard your father make the very same speech, and he made it all the way to a pauper's grave." She set the candle down upon the little washstand, and for a moment something almost human crossed her face, some old exhaustion. "You could have been dull, Sidonie. I asked so little of you. I asked only that you be dull and quiet and grateful, and let me marry my daughters well. Instead you stood up in a room full of the finest people in 3 counties and called Mr. Ferris a liar to his face." "I called the paper a forgery," said Sidonie, "because it was one. It does not matter what it was." Lady Vane's voice cracked just once at the edge. "It matters that a woman of no fortune, no name worth speaking, and no invitation of her own accused a gentleman of a crime in front of the Duke of Wrenhaven. Do you understand what that man is? Do you understand what he can do to this family if he chooses to be displeased?" She drew a slow breath and mastered herself. He said nothing. He sat there like a stone the whole while and said nothing. And that silence, girl, is worse than any shouting. He will remember Harrowden Grange as the house that insulted his guest at its own table. And so Harrowden Grange must be seen to cast out the offender. You, before he sends word, before the tale reaches London. You will be gone and forgotten, and the fault will go with you. Sidonie understood then that she was not a person to her aunt at all, and perhaps never had been, only a debt whose ledger was now being closed. They gave her a quarter of an hour to dress. They gave her the gown she had worn the night before, a good gown, the only good thing she owned, sea-grey silk that had belonged to her mother and been let out twice, and now creased down the front from lying crumpled on the floor. They gave her the wool cloak that had seen 8 winters. They gave her a small cloth purse that Sidonie did not open until later, and when she did, she found it held 2 guineas and some silver, the going rate, she supposed, for a niece. They did not give her breakfast. Petronella caught her at the top of the stairs. For a moment, Sidoni thought her cousin meant to say something kind, some last soft word between 2 girls who had shared a nursery. Instead, Petronella leaned close enough that Sidoni could smell the rosewater on her, and whispered, "You always thought yourself so much cleverer than the rest of us. Cleverer than Mamma. Look where it has put you." She drew back, satisfied. "The Duke will forget your name by Tuesday, but everyone will remember that you had to be turned out like a thief. I shall be married by summer, and you shall be nothing at all." Sidoni looked at her cousin, at the bright, cruel pleasure in her face, and felt the old, dangerous heat rise in her chest, the very heat that had ruined her. She could have said a great deal. She knew, for instance, precisely why her aunt had been so eager to flatter the Duke, and precisely which of the family's debts Mr. Ferris held, and precisely what that forged paper had been meant to secure. She knew 100 sharp, true things, and every one of them sat behind her teeth like a blade. She said none of them. It was the first genuinely wise decision she had made in a year, and it tasted like ash. "Goodbye, Petronella," she said, and went down the stairs. The cart was waiting in the yard, a common farm cart with a driver her uncle had hired from the village, a silent man who would not meet her eye. Sir Rowland Vane himself did not come out to see her go. That, more than anything, told Sidoni how the wind sat. Her uncle was a weak man, but not entirely without heart, and if he had stayed indoors, it was because his wife had forbidden him the small mercy of a farewell. The driver flicked the reins, the cart lurched forward over the frozen ruts, and Harrowden Grange, with its blind, frosted windows and its warm rooms she would never enter again, slid away behind her into the white morning. Sidoni did not weep. Weeping was a coin her aunt liked to be paid in, and she would not pay it, not even now, with no one watching but a hired man and a pair of crows lifting off a bare hedge. She pulled the old cloak tight and turned her face to the road ahead, to the pale fells rising cold and enormous on either side. And she made herself think, because thinking was the only thing she had ever truly owned. She had 2 guineas. She had a mother's gown and a father's ruined name. She had a mind that could read a forged hand at 40 paces, a skill her father had taught her by candlelight when she was a child, and he was still an honest scrivener, before the world decided that a man who could copy any signature perfectly must surely be a criminal, and made him one by believing it. She had, in short, everything and nothing at once, precisely the qualities that made a woman dangerous, and none of those that let her survive. The cart carried her north, away from everything she knew, toward a crossroads inn she had never heard of, where the driver had been paid to leave her and go. And somewhere behind her, in a great cold house she could not yet imagine, a man with a ruined hand and an unreadable face was already asking his steward a single quiet question about a grey-eyed girl who had called a liar at her aunt's table. But Sidoni did not know that yet. She knew only the cold, and the road, and the 2 coins in her purse, and the enormous, frightening freedom of having nothing left in all the world to lose. The inn was called the Sparrow and Scythe, and it crouched at the meeting of 4 bad roads like something that had given up hope of travellers a long time ago. By the time the cart reached it, the frost had turned to a thin driving sleet, and the driver did not so much help Sidoni down as wait, stone-faced, for her to climb down herself. He set her small trunk in the mud, touched his hat without warmth, and turned the cart around in the yard without a single word. Within a minute, the sound of the wheels had been swallowed by the wind, and Sidoni stood alone before a low stone door with a lamp guttering behind its horn panes. She had learned exactly how the world received a woman arriving alone with no man, no maid, and no explanation. So she did not knock timidly. She lifted the latch and walked in as though she owned the place, and let the warmth and the smell of tallow and old ale close over her. The common room was nearly empty. A shepherd dozed in the corner. Behind the counter stood a broad woman of perhaps 50 with forearms like a blacksmith's, and a face that had clearly decided long ago to be surprised by nothing. This, Sidoni would learn, was Mrs. Otley, who kept the inn while her husband kept the horses, and who regarded every stranger as a problem to be priced before it could become a problem to be solved. Mrs. Ottley looked at the grey silk gown, ruined at the hem with mud. She looked at the good cloak, worn thin. She looked at the trunk, and the lack of a companion, and the particular way the young woman held her chin, and she came to several conclusions, most of them uncharitable. "We're full," said Mrs. Ottley, who was not. Sidonie understood this for what it was, a gate she was being made to prove she could pass. "You are not full," she said pleasantly, unlacing her wet cloak. "You have 3 empty rooms above stairs, because I heard no one moving up there when I came in, and a full house makes noise. You do not want to take me because you have decided I am either a runaway wife with an angry husband to follow, or a woman of no character with no money to pay. I am neither. I am a gentlewoman fallen on hard times, which is a great deal more common than either, and a great deal less trouble. And I can pay for a small room and a supper tonight and think about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." For a long moment Mrs. Ottley said nothing, then slowly the corner of her hard mouth turned upward, not quite a smile but a near relation of one. "You talk," said Mrs. Ottley, "like a woman who's been thrown out of somewhere fine." "I have," said Sidonie. "This morning, before breakfast, I find I am extremely hungry." And that plain honesty, more than all the cleverness before it, was what won her the room. Mrs. Ottley snorted, reached beneath the counter for a key and jerked her head toward the stairs. "Small room at the back. 6pence the night, supper's another 4pence, and you'll get mutton and be grateful. And whatever you did, girl, keep it to yourself under my roof. I've enough trouble of my own." Sidonie got the mutton, and she was grateful, more grateful than she would ever have admitted to the sharp-eyed woman who set it before her. She ate every scrap, and sopped the gravy with the coarse bread, and felt the warmth of it push back, just a little, against the great cold fact of her situation. Then she climbed to the small back room with its narrow bed and its one rushlight, and she sat down, and she finally allowed herself to be afraid. 2 guineas and some silver, a room at 6pence the night. She could last, if she was careful, perhaps 3 weeks. And then what? There was no post of governess to be had by a woman with no reference and a scandal not a day old. There was no shop, no situation, no distant kindly relation. Her father's people were dead or as ruined as he had been. Her mother's people were the Vanes. She had reached, at 23, the exact edge of the map, the place past which respectable women were not permitted to go, and the 2 roads that ran on from here were both of them dark. It was then, sitting on the hard little bed with the rushlight throwing her shadow huge and trembling on the wall, that she took her aunt's parting gift properly from her mind and examined it, the way she examined everything for the truth beneath the surface, because her aunt had lied, not about casting her out, that had been true enough. But Lady Vane had said the Duke sat silent and said nothing, that his silence was displeasure, that the whole disaster was Sidonie's fault alone. And Sidonie, replaying the dinner in her memory as she replayed everything, found that the story did not add up. She had stood, that night, and pointed at the settlement paper Mr. Ferris had laid so proudly upon the table, the paper meant to bind a loan against Harrowden Grange, and she had said, in a clear, carrying voice that had frozen the whole room, that the signature at its foot was false. She knew the shape of a forged hand the way a musician knows a sour note, and that signature had been drawn, not written, the letters built up stroke by careful stroke by a hand, copying rather than signing. And the signature it copied, she realized now, sitting alone in the cold, had not been her uncle's at all. It had been the Duke's. Someone had forged the Duke of Wrenhaven's name. Someone had meant to use it, through Mr. Ferris, to bind money and land in a way the Duke had never agreed to. And Sidonie, in her terrible, ungovernable honesty, had stood up at a crowded table and destroyed the scheme before it could be sprung. Her aunt did not cast her out because she had embarrassed a guest. Her aunt cast her out because Sidonie had seen too much, and because a girl who could read a forged hand was a danger to whatever her aunt and Mr. Ferris had been building together in the dark. She had not been thrown away for having too much spirit. She had been thrown away for having too much sight. Sidney sat very still with this knowledge, and the rushlight burned lower, and the sleet ticked against the little window like fingernails. And then, on the far edge of the wind, she heard it, the sound of horses. Not one horse, not the plod of a farmer's nag, but a team, 4 of them at least, moving fast and heavy up the frozen crossroads lane in the black of a night when no honest traveller had any business abroad. She heard the crunch of great wheels. She heard them slow. She heard them stop in the yard below her window, before the door of an inn that had no reason on earth to expect so grand a guest. Sidney rose, her heart beating hard and high in her throat, and went to the window and wiped the fog from the glass with the heel of her hand. Below, in the wet lamplight, stood a carriage black as a hearse, and upon its door, picked out in silver, was a crest she had seen only once before, the night before, embossed upon a card at her aunt's fine table, the wren and the crossed keys, the arms of the Duke of Wrenhaven. He had found her, and she did not, for the life of her, know whether that was the best thing that had ever happened to her, or the very last. Mrs. Ottley was at the foot of the stairs when Sidney came down, and for the first time the innkeeper's weathered composure had deserted her entirely. She was smoothing her apron with both hands over and over, staring at the door as though it might bite her. "There's a duke," she hissed at Sidney, in the tone of a woman reporting a house fire. "In my yard. An actual duke." His man came in and asked, cool as you please, whether a young gentlewoman had taken a room this evening. A young gentlewoman, traveling alone. And I said. She stopped. She looked at Sidney with dawning, appalled understanding. "What did you do, girl? What in heaven's name did you do?" "I told the truth," said Sidney. "To the wrong person. It appears to be my only talent." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Beneath the calm, her mind was racing through possibilities like water down a gutter, and none of them were good. He had come himself. A duke did not travel through sleet at midnight to a crossroads inn to a woman who had merely inconvenienced him. He had come himself, which meant the matter was grave, and there was nowhere left past this to run. The door opened. The cold came in first, and then he came in with it. Sidney had seen the Duke of Wrenhaven once, across a crowded table, half in candlelight and half in shadow, and she had thought him then a hard, still, unreadable man. Seeing him now, filling the low doorway of the Sparrow and Scythe with the knight at his back, she understood she had underestimated every part of him. He was tall, and built like a man who had done hard physical things and might do them again, and he wore black, all black, so that his face above it seemed very pale and very grave. His hair was dark and unfashionably plain. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were a cold, clear grey, the grey of ice over deep water, and they did not waver. He was, she guessed, some 35. He carried himself like a man a great deal older, or a great deal more tired. He held his left hand loose at his side. His right he kept close against his coat, half curled, and even in her fear, Sidney's trained eye caught the wrongness of it, the stiffness, the way the fingers did not open. A ruined hand. She filed the fact away without knowing yet what it meant. "Miss Lark," said the Duke of Wrenhaven. He knew her name. "Your Grace," said Sidney, and dropped a curtsy that was, she was aware, entirely too late to save her. For a long moment he simply looked at her, the way she imagined he looked at a horse he meant to buy, or an argument he meant to dismantle. Mrs. Ottley had pressed herself flat against the wall and appeared to be attempting to become part of it. The sleeping shepherd had woken and fled. The whole common room had arranged itself around the still dark figure of the Duke like iron filings around a lodestone. "You called Ambrose Ferris a forger," the Duke said at last. His voice was low and level and gave nothing away. "At your aunt's table, before 24 witnesses." Here it was. Sidney lifted her chin. If she was to be ruined, she would at least not cringe while it was done. "I did, Your Grace. They have put you out for it." "They have." with 2 guineas and a cloak into the coldest week of the year. With rather good aim, said Sidonie, considering they gave me no notice. Something moved at the corner of the Duke's grave mouth. It was gone before she could name it. He took a step further into the room, and then another, until he stood close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, and she made herself hold it, because looking away felt like the first step toward disappearing altogether. "Do you know," he said quietly, "how many people in the whole of my life have told me a truth I did not wish to hear, in a room where it cost them something to say it?" Sidonie did not answer. She sensed the question was not truly for her. "Very few," said the Duke of Wrenhaven, "and every one of them, Miss Lark, I have had reason to remember." He reached with his good left hand into the breast of his black coat and drew out a folded document, heavy paper sealed with a great disk of dark wax. And Sidonie, whose whole life had taught her to read a paper before she read the face of the man holding it, felt her breath stop in her chest. She had expected, if he came at all, that he would come with an accusation. A magistrate's warrant, perhaps, for slandering a gentleman, a demand that she recant. At the very best, at the very kindest, she had allowed herself to hope he might come to tell her aunt she had been wrong, to clear her name in some cold, formal way, and then leave her to freeze in peace with her honor and nothing else. She had not, in any version of the night she had imagined, expected this. The Duke held the folded paper out to her. When she did not take it, he simply waited, patient as the fells, until at last she lifted her hand and received it. The wax was still faintly warm. It had been sealed recently. It had been sealed, she realized, on the road, in the carriage, on the way to find her. "Read it," said the Duke. "You are the only person of my acquaintance I can be certain will understand every word." Her fingers were not quite steady as she broke the seal. She unfolded the stiff paper toward the light of Mrs. Otley's lamp, and she read the first line, and then she read it again, because the first time her mind refused to carry the words in. It was a contract of marriage, drawn up in a lawyer's careful hand, complete but for 2 things: the name of the bride, left blank. And at the foot, where the groom's signature should have stood, a labored, effortful, painfully formed scrawl, the writing of a man whose hand could barely hold a pen, and yet had held one, and signed. Evander Cade, Duke of Wrenhaven. He had signed it already. He had signed it before he knew whether she would say yes, before he had spoken a word to her, before he had even seen her face in the lamplight of this wretched inn. He had signed his ruined hand's crooked name to a marriage contract with a blank where her name should go, and carried it through the sleet to lay in the hands of a disgraced, penniless, cast-out woman. Sidonie looked up from the paper. Her whole careful composure, the armor of 11 hard years, had cracked straight down the middle, and she did not have the smallest idea how to hold her face. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "This is a marriage contract." "It is," said the Duke of Wrenhaven. "They expect an apology, my aunt, Ferris, the whole of the county. They expect you to have come to demand one, or to give one, or to bury me." She was aware she was speaking too fast and could not stop. A duke does not marry a woman he has never spoken to. A duke does not marry a woman with no fortune and no name, and a scandal not a day old. It makes no sense. There is no sense in it at all. "No," the Duke agreed. His grey eyes held hers, and for just an instant, beneath the cold and the stillness, she saw something she had not expected to find in the most feared man in the north. She saw that he was watching her every bit as carefully as she was watching him, and that he was, in his own contained and mortal way, afraid of the answer. "There is no sense in it. There is only a reason, and I will tell you the reason, Miss Lark, gladly, and all of it, but not in a common room with a landlady counting every word to sell in the morning." He stepped back. He inclined his dark head, a small, precise gesture of respect that no one in 11 years had thought to offer her. "You owe me nothing," he said. "You may throw that paper in the fire, and I will drive away tonight, and you will never see me again. And I will still see to it that the truth about the forgery is known and your name is cleared, because that much you have earned whatever you decide. But if you are willing to hear me, I would ask an hour of your time. 1 hour. And then you may choose. Sidoni stood in the wavering lamplight with a signed marriage contract trembling in her hand and a ruined man's crooked name at the foot of it, and she understood that whatever she had thought her life was going to be, from this hour onward it was going to be something else entirely. She did not yet know the shape of the trap that had been laid, the night before, at her aunt's fine table, or how deep it ran, or how her strange, sharp gift had made her the one person in the north who could spring it. She knew only that the most powerful man she had ever met had crossed a freezing county to place a choice, an actual choice, into the hands of a woman the world had thrown away. 1 hour, said Sidoni Lark, and she folded the contract carefully, along its original creases, and did not give it back. The Duke's carriage was warmer than any room Sidoni had sat in for 11 years, and she distrusted it at once. Warmth, in her experience, was a thing that came with a price attached, and she had learned to read the price before she accepted the comfort. He had not, in fact, carried her off. That was the first thing that surprised her. When she agreed to the hour, he did not sweep her into the dark and away. Instead, he had a private parlour opened at the Sparrow and Scythe, paid Mrs. Otley enough to make her forget every word she overheard, and had a proper fire built up and a pot of hot chocolate brought before he would speak of business at all. He sat across the small table from Sidoni with his ruined right hand resting quiet in his lap, and he watched her drink, and he did not begin until the shivering had left her shoulders. "You are wondering," he said at last, "why a man with my name and my fortune would sign a marriage contract to a woman he had never spoken to and carry it through sleet to a crossroads inn. You have decided there must be a trap in it somewhere. You are looking for the trap." "I am," said Sidoni. "I have not found it yet. That worries me more than if I had." The Duke of Wrenhaven made a low sound that she thought, with some astonishment, might have been the ghost of a laugh. "Then let me spare you the search. There is no trap. There is a war, and I am losing it. And only last night at your aunt's table, I watched a penniless woman do in 1 sentence what my lawyers have failed to do in a year." He leaned forward. The firelight moved across the hard planes of his face. "Ambrose Ferris is forging my name, Miss Lark, not once. Not on the paper you exposed. For a year and more, on notes and settlements and letters of credit across 3 counties, he has been building a fortune of debt and land, all of it bound to the name of Wrenhaven, and none of it authorized by me. When the whole edifice is complete, he will call it in. He will present a mountain of my signatures to the courts, every one of them false, and he will ruin me because a forged hand well made is nearly impossible to disprove, and the law believes paper over men." Sidoni set down her cup. Her mind had already leapt ahead of him, the way it always did, the pieces sliding and clicking. "Nearly impossible," she said slowly, "for anyone who cannot read a forged hand." "Yes," said the Duke. "And you cannot disprove it yourself. Because—" She looked deliberately at the curled stillness of his right hand, and then back to his face, and she did not soften the observation, because she sensed he would despise softening. "Because your own signature is no longer steady. Something has happened to your hand. Your true signature would not match the signatures of your youth, on the old, genuine documents. Which means when you stand up in court and say the false ones are forged, Ferris need only produce a paper you truly signed last year, and it too will look nothing like the rest, and the jury will see a man whose own name has changed and conclude he is simply trying to escape his debts." The Duke of Wrenhaven was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped very low. "I have paid 3 lawyers a great deal of money," he said, "to explain that to me, and not one of them explained it half so quickly nor half so plainly." He studied her with those clear grey eyes. "You understood it before I finished the sentence." "My father taught me," said Sidoni simply. "It is the only inheritance he left that no creditor could seize. Then you understand my position entirely, and I need not flatter you with a longer telling of it. I am a man whose name can be written more convincingly by his enemy than by himself. I need someone who can prove which signatures are true and which are false, someone who can stand before a magistrate and demonstrate it so plainly that even a fool must see. There is, so far as I have been able to discover in a year of searching, exactly one person in the north with that gift. He inclined his head to her. She called Ferris a liar at her aunt's table and was thrown into the snow for it. Sidney understood the shape of the thing now, and it was not, after all, a trap. It was something rarer and more dangerous. It was an offer of use. "Then hire me," she said. "You do not need to marry a woman to employ her eyes. Pay me. Give me a desk and the papers, and I will find every false stroke Ferris ever made and hang him with them. Why the contract? Why a wife?" "2 reasons," said the Duke, "and I will give you both because I think you would forgive a great deal sooner than you would forgive being managed." He held up one finger of his good hand. "The first is the law. A wife cannot be silenced by threat once she chooses to speak for her husband, and more to my purpose, her word carries the weight of the house she has married into. If Miss Sidney Lark, a disgraced niece, stands up in court and says the signatures are forged, Ferris will paint her a bitter woman selling lies for coin, and half the jury will believe him. If the Duchess of Wrenhaven says it, the case is altogether different. I do not offer you my name only to protect you, Miss Lark, though it would do that. I offer it because your gift is worthless to me unless the world is made to listen, and the world will listen to a duchess, where it will not listen to a governess." It was the coldest and most honest thing a man had ever said to her, and she trusted it far more than she would have trusted tenderness. "And the second reason," she said. Here, for the first time, the Duke of Wrenhaven hesitated. It was a small hesitation, quickly mastered, but Sidney saw it, and she marked it, and she understood that she had just brushed the edge of the thing he had not yet told her. "The second reason," he said evenly, "is my own, and it is not one I will give tonight." He met her eyes without flinching. "I will tell you this much, and no more, and you must decide whether you can live with a man who keeps one locked room. There is a reason I need a wife, and not merely an ally, that has nothing to do with Ferris at all. It touches my family, and it touches an old wound, and it is mine to open when I choose. If that is a price you cannot pay, throw the contract in the fire now, with my blessing, and I will still clear your name. But if you can abide one closed door in a house I am otherwise offering to open to you entirely, then write your name in the blank, Miss Lark, and let us go to war together." Sidney sat with the fire warm on one side of her face and the great cold uncertainty of her whole life on the other. He was offering her everything the world had told her she could never have. A name. A roof no one could put her out of on a whim. Work that used the one gift she owned. And in exchange he asked her to fight his enemy, to endure his temper, which she did not doubt he had, and to accept that somewhere in his grand cold house there was a locked room she was not, yet, permitted to enter. She had spent 11 years in a house that was entirely locked to her. One closed door, in exchange for all the rest, was not a bargain that frightened a woman like Sidney Lark. "I will want it in writing," she said, "that my wages, should I ever choose to think of them as wages, are my own, and cannot be taken from me for any cause, including displeasing you. I have been a poor relation, Your Grace. I will not be one again, not even to a duke." "Agreed," said the Duke of Wrenhaven, and something in his grave face eased. "And I will want to know your Christian name," Sidney added, "since I am apparently about to take it. I have read it at the foot of the contract, but I would rather hear a man say his own name than steal it off a paper." "Evander," he said. "Evander," she repeated, testing the shape of it. Then she reached for the pen and the little traveling inkwell his man had set upon the table, and in the blank left waiting for her, in a clear, firm hand that did not tremble at all, she wrote her name. And she thought as the ink dried that she had just made either the wisest bargain or the greatest folly of her life. and that in her experience the two were very frequently the same thing wearing different coats. They were married 11 days later, quietly, by special license, in the small chapel of the Duke's estate at Wrenhaven Hall, with only his steward and his housekeeper for witnesses, and a hard, bright winter sun coming through the old glass. Sidonie wore her mother's grey silk, cleaned and pressed now by hands other than her own, and she found, standing at the altar beside the tall grave man in black, that she felt nothing so simple as fear or joy, but rather the taut, alert calm of a woman who has picked up a tool and means to use it well. She had expected a grand cold house and a grand cold husband and a great deal of loneliness dressed up in silk. She got the house. But the very morning after the wedding, the Duke sent his steward to bring her to the muniment room, and there, waiting for her upon a long oak table, were the papers. There were chests of them, hauled up from the strong room and the county archives and 3 separate lawyers' offices, a year's harvest of every document that bore the name of Wrenhaven. And the Duke of Wrenhaven stood among them like a general surveying a lost field, and he turned to his new wife, and he said, Show me how it is done, so that I may believe it can be done at all." So she showed him. It was, Sidonie would think afterward, the truest wedding they had. Not the chapel, not the ring, but that long, bright winter afternoon in the muniment room, with the sun crawling across the floor and the papers spread between them, when she taught the Duke of Wrenhaven to see with her eyes. "A man who signs his name does not draw it," she said, holding 2 documents to the light. "He writes it, all at once, without lifting the pen except where he must, and his hand has its own habits it cannot help, the pressure heavier here, the tail of this letter flung long out of pure carelessness, the dot of this one always fallen just to the right because he is in a hurry to be done. A forger draws. He copies the shape and loses the habit. Look." She laid her finger beside 2 versions of the same name. "This is a signature. This is a picture of one. Once you have seen the difference, you cannot unsee it." The Duke bent over the papers. He was quiet a long time. And then Sidonie watched something happen in his hard face that she had not seen there before. A slow dawning, the particular pleasure of a clever man being shown a thing he had thought impossible, and finding it, suddenly, plain. "There," he said, and his voice had changed. "The tale. On the true one it runs long. On the false it stops short every time because he has not the nerve to be careless." "Because he has not the nerve to be careless," Sidonie agreed. "Forgery is a coward's art. It is terrified of its own hand. That terror is where it always betrays itself." They worked through the whole short winter day and did not notice the light go. By the time the housekeeper came to ask about dinner, Sidonie had sorted a full chest into 2 clean piles, the true and the false, and had begun a 3rd pile, a small one, of documents she could not yet be certain of, and it was in that 3rd pile, near the very bottom, that she found the thing that made her go still. It was a letter of credit, a large one, binding a sum of money against a parcel of the Wrenhaven land, and the signature at its foot was one of Ferris's forgeries. She was certain of that within a breath. The tale stopped short, but it was not the signature that stopped her heart. It was the second name on the paper. The name of the witness who had signed below to swear the Duke's hand was genuine, the name of the respectable 3rd party whose word turned a piece of fraud into a document a court would honor. The witness was a man called Josiah Meese, and Sidonie knew that name. She had seen it in her uncle's study, in a ledger she was never meant to read, in her years beneath the Vane's roof. Josiah Meese was her uncle's man of business. Josiah Meese worked for the Vanes, which meant the forgery that had thrown her into the snow and the forgery that was ruining the Duke of Wrenhaven were not 2 schemes at all. They were one. Ferris had not been working alone. He had been working with her aunt's household from the very beginning, and the loan Sidonie had exposed at that fine, cruel dinner had not been meant to bind Harrowden Grange to Ferris. It had been meant to bind Harrowden Grange and the Duke together in a single net. Sidonie stood very still with the letter in her hand, and her mind running fast and cold. She did not yet know why her aunt would climb into bed with a forger, or what the Vanes stood to gain from the ruin of a duke, or how deep the rot ran. But she understood, with the sick certainty of a woman who has just felt the floor tilt, that she had married into a war far larger than the one Evander had described to her at the inn, and that the enemy who had cast her out and the enemy who threatened her husband were the same enemy, and that they did not yet know she had seen it. She looked up. The Duke was watching her from across the table, and he had seen the change in her face because he saw a great deal more than he let anyone know. "You have found something," he said quietly. Sidoni looked down at the letter, at the 2 false names sworn true, and she made a decision in the space of a breath. She would tell him, but not tonight, not until she was certain, because a thing this large told too soon could cost them both the war. She had been thrown out of one house for speaking before she could prove it. She would not lose this one the same way. "I have found," she said, "that your Mr. Ferris is even more thorough than you feared. Give me a week, Evander. Give me a week, and I will bring you not a suspicion but a rope." The rumor reached Wrenhaven Hall before the emissary did, the way rumor always outrides the men it concerns. It came first through the housekeeper, Mrs. Denby, a spare, upright woman who had served the family 30 years and disapproved of gossip on principle and repeated it flawlessly all the same. She brought it to Sidney over the morning accounts, her mouth pursed as though the words tasted of vinegar. The county, it seemed, had learned that the Duke of Wrenhaven had married, and the county did not know what to make of it at all. "They are saying, Mrs." Denby reported, "begging your pardon, Your Grace, that His Grace has married a woman thrown out of Harrowden Grange for her tongue, and some are saying worse, that you bewitched him, that you trapped him. Lady Vane herself, they say, is telling anyone who will sit still that her poor mad niece imposed upon a grieving gentleman, and that the marriage will be the ruin of a great house." Mrs. Denby sniffed. "I did not credit a word of it, naturally." "Naturally," said Sidoni, who could hear in the housekeeper's careful phrasing that she had credited a good deal of it until quite recently, and had changed her mind only after 11 days of watching the new Duchess work 16 hours in the muniment room without once ringing a bell to be waited on. It was 3 days after that the carriage came up the long avenue, and Sidoni, who happened to be at the tall window of the muniment room, watched it come with a slow, cold tightening in her chest, because she knew the carriage. She had ridden away from it a fortnight ago in the frost. It was her uncle's second-best chaise, and the man who climbed down from it, arranging his coat and his expression with equal care, was Josiah Meese. They had sent the man of business, not her aunt and not Ferris, and Sidoni understood the message as clearly as if it had been written out. They did not yet know that she had seen his name on the forged letter. They thought him a safe, deniable errand boy. They had sent him to do the thing that families do when a cast-out daughter marries beyond all expectation. They had sent him to bring her to heel. She met him in the great hall, and she did not send for the Duke, though a footman offered to fetch him. This was hers to answer, and she would answer it standing on her own feet. "Mr. Meese," she said, "you are a long way from Harrowden Grange." Josiah Meese was a smooth, grey man of the kind who has never in his life had a thought he could not sell. He bowed and smiled and produced from his voice a warmth that had never once reached his eyes in all the years Sidoni had known him. "Your Grace," he said, savouring the title as though it were faintly absurd, a joke the two of them shared. "May I say how very glad the whole family is at your remarkable good fortune. Your aunt was quite overcome. She sends her fondest love and her hope that old quarrels may be forgotten between kin who have risen so high." "Does she?" said Sidoni. "She does, and she asks only, as any loving aunt would, that you not forget where you came from, that you remember the family that sheltered you. There are, she thought you might wish to know, certain small matters at Harrowden that a word from a duchess could set right, certain debts, certain difficulties with Mr. Ferris, who has been so good a friend to the family and asks so little." Meese spread his soft hands. "A trifling sum, set against your new estate, a signature here or there to smooth a creditor's nerves, family helping family. Your aunt was certain you would see the justice of it." And there it was, laid bare on the cold flags of the great hall. They did not want her repentance. They wanted her signature. They had spent a year forging the name of Wrenhaven, And now, by the cruelest joke of all, the name of Wrenhaven had walked into their scheme wearing the face of the very girl they had thrown into the snow, and they meant to use her to sign the true documents that would make their false ones safe. She was not being called home, she was being recruited into her own ruin. Sidney looked at Josiah Meese, at his soft grey smile, and she felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, the heat that had cost her everything once already. And for the first time in her life she did not fight it down. She let it come, and she found that it had become something colder and far more useful than rage. "You may take a message to my aunt," said Sidoni, and her voice rang clear across the great stone hall. "Tell her that her niece remembers exactly where she came from. Tell her I remember every ledger, every debt, every name written in a hand that was not its owner's. Tell her that the girl she threw out with 2 guineas can read a forged signature at 40 paces, and that she has spent the last fortnight doing precisely that, in the muniment room of the man you meant to destroy." She saw the smile die on Meese's face, saw the color leave it, saw the exact instant he understood that the errand boy had walked into the one house where his master's secret was already known. "And tell her," Sidney finished, very softly now, "that I am no longer a poor relation to be managed. I am the Duchess of Wrenhaven, and I am coming for all of you." Josiah Meese did not say another word. He bowed, a jerky, frightened thing nothing like the smooth performance he had brought in with him, and he fled, and the great door thudded shut behind him. Sidoni stood alone in the sudden silence. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirts until they stopped. She had just declared war aloud, to the enemy's own messenger, and there was no unsaying it now. Her aunt would know within a day. Ferris would know. The quiet, careful year they had spent building their forged fortune would curdle into something urgent and dangerous, because a cornered schemer is far more perilous than a patient one. And she had just cornered them. Which meant they would not wait now. They would come. Not a messenger next time. Not a smooth, grey man with a soft smile. They would come themselves, the full weight of them, and soon, before she could finish assembling the rope she had promised her husband. Behind her, unheard until he spoke, the Duke of Wrenhaven said, "So, it begins." Sidoni turned. He stood at the foot of the great stair, and he had heard, she saw, every word. His grey eyes were fixed on her, and in them was something she had not seen before, not warmth exactly, but its near neighbor, a fierce and startled admiration that he made no effort at all to hide. "It begins," Sidoni agreed. And she did not tell him, yet, how afraid she was. There would be time enough for that, and for the closed room he had not opened, and for the thing beneath the war that neither of them had yet named. For now there was only the two of them in the cold great hall, and the enemy riding hard toward them through the winter, and the strange, new and undeniable fact that for the first time in 11 years, Sidney Lark was not facing the storm alone. The letter that broke him open arrived on a grey afternoon, 9 days after Josiah Meese fled the great hall, and it was, of all cruel things, an invitation. Sidney was in the muniment room when the Duke came in holding it, and she knew at once that something was wrong, because he was holding it in his ruined right hand. In the fortnight and more of their marriage, she had never once seen him use that hand for anything. He kept it curled and hidden, a thing he was ashamed of, and now he held a folded paper crushed within it, as though he had forgotten the hand was his, or as though he no longer cared who saw. "They mean to come," he said. His voice was strange, flattened, scraped hollow. "Ferris, your aunt. They have written to invite themselves to Wrenhaven Hall, to call upon the new Duchess and offer their felicitations in 3 days. It is a courtesy, the letter says." He laughed, and there was no humor anywhere in it. "A courtesy. They are coming to see how much we know. And they have chosen the day with care, Sidoni. They have chosen the anniversary." "The anniversary of what?" He did not answer. He set the crushed letter down on the oak table, and Sidoni saw that his hand was trembling, the ruined fingers jerking against his will, and that his whole face had gone the color of old ash. He turned away from her toward the tall window, and he stood with his back to her, rigid, his shoulders drawn up, and she understood that she was watching a very proud man come apart at the seams and try, with everything left in him, not to let it be seen. She had learned, in 11 years under her aunt's roof, exactly what pity did to a person in that state. It finished them. Pity was the thing you offered when you had decided a person was broken past mending, and the offering of it confirmed the verdict. She had been pitied, and had hated it more than cruelty, because cruelty at least treated her as an equal worth striking, while pity treated her as already dead. So she did not go to him with soft eyes and softer words. She crossed the room and she stood beside him at the window, not touching him, and she looked out at the same grey fells he was looking at, and she said in her ordinary dry voice, as though they were still at their work, "Tell me about the hand. I have wondered since the inn. You will fight better once it is said, and I'm tired of you fighting badly." For a long moment she thought she had judged it wrong. His breath came ragged, and then, slowly, the terrible rigidity went out of his shoulders, not because she had comforted him, but because she had, of all things, given him a task, a question to answer, something to do with the grief besides drown in it. "There was a fire," said Evander Cade. 4 years ago. This day, 4 years ago." He lifted the ruined hand and looked at it as though it belonged to a stranger. "The west wing of this house. My wife was inside it, my first wife. Her name was Aveline, and she was 26, and she was carrying our child, and the fire took the whole wing before the servants could reach the far stair." His jaw worked. "I reached it. I went back in through the burning stair, and I got as far as her door, and the door was hot, so hot, and I could hear her on the other side of it, and I could not open it, because the frame had warped in the heat and it would not give, and I put my hands to it, and I pulled." He closed the ruined fingers, slowly, as far as they would go, which was not far. "I pulled until the iron latch burned my hand past all saving, and the door did not open. And she died on the other side of it while I was pulling, and they had to drag me out, and this is what I brought away. A hand that will not open a door from a night I could not open the one door that mattered." Sidonie stood very still. The grey light lay cold across both their faces. "That is the locked room," she said quietly. "The one you would not open to me at the inn. Not a room in the house, this day, this wound. That is the locked room. And the second reason you needed a wife, and not merely an ally." She was working it through even now, gently, the way she worked through everything, because understanding was the only tenderness she truly trusted. It was not only for the war with Ferris, it was this, the line, "You are the last of your name, and a man who has watched his wife and child burn does not easily go courting again, and yet the name of Wrenhaven dies with you if you do not. You needed a wife. But you could not bear to want one, so you found a way to marry that had nothing to do with wanting, a contract, a war, a woman you had a reason to marry so that you would never have to admit you had a wish to." He turned and looked at her then, and his grey eyes were wet, and he did not hide it, and that, she understood, was the greatest thing he had ever given anyone, greater than the name, greater than the house. "Yes," he said, "God help me. Yes." "You are a coward, Evander Cade," said Sidonie, and her voice, though it was very soft, did not tremble at all. "In exactly one particular. You would sign a marriage contract with your burned hand and carry it through sleet to a stranger, because that could be called strategy. But you would not walk across a room and tell a woman you were lonely, because that could only be called need. You have dressed up your whole heart as a battle plan so that no one, least of all you, would ever have to see it for what it is." She did not know where the courage came from, except that he had opened his ruined hand to her, and she could not, in decency, keep her own closed. "And I will tell you why I am not afraid of your locked room," she went on. "It is because I have one of my own. I was thrown out of every warm place I ever stood, until I learned to want nothing, because wanting was the surest way to be hurt. I made my heart a ledger, columns and proofs and nothing that could not be accounted for. And then a burned man in a black coat handed me a contract with a blank in it and asked me to write my name where a wish should go. And I did. And I told myself it was only strategy. She took a breath. It was not only strategy, not for me. It has not been for some days now, and I am tired, Evander, of us both fighting badly. He reached out with his good left hand and very slowly, as though she might break, or he might, he laid it against the side of her face. His palm was warm. She had spent 11 years flinching from touch, and she did not flinch from this. She leaned, the smallest fraction, into the warmth of it, the way a plant kept too long in the dark leans toward a window. "You are not a stranger," he said. "You have not been a stranger since the muniment room. I have been trying this whole while to keep you a colleague, because a colleague cannot be lost the way a wife can be lost, and I find I cannot do it. You have made yourself necessary, and worse than necessary. You have made yourself wanted, and I have not wanted anything in 4 years but the mercy of not wanting." "Then we are both very poor cowards," Sidonie whispered. "And we have both been found out." They stood a long time at the window with the grey day dying around them, and his hand against her face, and neither of them spoke of Ferris, or the anniversary, or the enemy riding toward them through the winter. The war could wait 1 hour, it had waited a year. And in the cold muniment room of a house that had known nothing but grief for 4 years, 2 people who had each made their hearts into fortresses set down, for the first time, the smallest stone of the wall. Then Sidonie straightened and wiped her eyes once, briskly, and turned back to the papers. 3 days, she said. "They come in 3 days. Then we have 3 days to finish the rope. Sit down, Evander. I am going to show you exactly how we are going to hang them. They came at noon on the 3rd day, and they came in force." Sidonie watched from the muniment window as the carriages turned in at the great avenue, and she counted them, and her stomach tightened, because there were 3. The first was her aunt's finest, the crest of the veins newly regilded upon its door in a bid at grandeur that fooled no one. The second was a hired chaise, plain and fast. The third she did not know, and the not knowing worried her, because she had learned that the peace you cannot account for is the peace that kills you. She had done what could be done in 3 days. She and Evander had worked through 2 nights nearly to dawn, and the fruit of it lay now in a locked dispatch box on the great table in the hall, and Sidonie had the only key on a ribbon at her throat. It was not the whole rope she wanted, but it was a noose, and a noose was enough to begin. They received the visitors in the great hall, and Sidonie stood at her husband's side, and she wore, deliberately, her mother's grey silk, the very gown she had been cast out in, because she wanted her aunt to see it and to understand. Lady Vane came in first, magnificent in claret velvet, her handsome, hard face arranged into a mask of warm, familial joy that did not reach past the powder. Behind her came Petronella and Maud, the one avid, the other frightened, exactly as they had stood in the corridor the morning of the casting out. And behind them came Ambrose Ferris. Sidonie had seen him only once across the ruinous dinner table. He was a large, soft man, expensively dressed, with small, clever eyes set in a wide, agreeable face, the face of a man who has swindled a great many people and been liked by most of them while he did it. He bowed low to the Duke, lower to the Duchess, and his small eyes went at once and could not help going to the locked dispatch box upon the table. And behind Ferris, last of all, came the man from the 3rd carriage, and Sidonie's blood ran cold because she knew him after all. He was old and stooped and dressed in the sober black of the law, and she had seen his name that very fortnight at the foot of a great many forged papers, sworn as witness. It was not Josiah Meese. Meese, she understood in a sickening rush, had been the small fish. This was the great one. This was Bartholomew Crewe, a magistrate, a man who sat in judgment across 2 counties, and who had been selling the weight of his office to Ferris 1 false oath at a time. They had not come to plead. They had come to win. They meant to turn the whole matter on its head, here, in the Duke's own hall, and to leave with the true signatures they needed one way or another. Lady Vane opened her mouth to begin some honeyed speech, and Ferris, smoother and faster, cut across her. "Your Grace," he said to the Duke, spreading his soft hands, "let us not pretend among friends that this is a social call. Your new Duchess has made certain accusations. She made one at her aunt's table that shamed a whole company, and she has, I am told, been repeating the theme in your muniment room ever since." His small eyes glittered. "It grieves me to say it, but the poor lady is not well. She was cast from her own family for exactly this sort of wild fancy, this seeing of crimes where none exist. And now, I fear, she has infected a grieving man with her delusion, and means to use the good name of Wrenhaven to destroy an honest gentleman who has done nothing but lend this family money at a fair rate for years." He turned to the magistrate. "Mr. Crewe has come at my request to hear the matter judged fairly, as a neutral officer of the law." It was beautifully done. Sidoni had to grant him that. He had, in 30 seconds, painted her mad, painted himself wronged, painted his own bought magistrate as an impartial judge, and set the trap so that any accusation she now made would sound like the very raving he had promised. She felt the old dinner-table panic rise, the sensation of a room turning against her, of the truth in her mouth curdling into evidence of her own madness. Then she looked at Evander, and Evander was watching her, calm as the fells, and she remembered that she was not at her aunt's table anymore, and that she was not alone, and that they had spent 2 nights building precisely the thing that would break this. "Mr. Crewe," said Sidoni, "before you judge, will you do one small thing as a neutral officer of the law? Will you write your name?" The magistrate blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Your name. Here, upon this paper, in ink, before all of us. Surely a neutral officer can have no objection to signing his own name in company." She laid a clean sheet upon the table and a pen beside it, and she smiled at him, and she saw the first flicker of fear cross his old face. "Come, it is a very little thing, unless there is some reason a magistrate should fear to write his own signature in the open, before witnesses." Crewe did not move. And his not moving was itself the first stroke of the rope, because everyone in the hall saw it, even Lady Vane, whose confident smile faltered for the first time. "You will not," said Sidoni softly. "I thought not. Then I will tell the company why." She unlocked the dispatch box at her throat's key, and she lifted from it a paper, and she held it to the light. "This is a letter of credit, binding £4,000 against the Wrenhaven land. It bears the forged signature of my husband, and beneath it, sworn as witness that the signature is true, the name of Bartholomew Crewe. It also bears, lower still, a second witness, a man of business named Josiah Meese, who is employed by my uncle, Sir Roland Vane." She let that land. She watched it land on her aunt's face, watched Lady Vane understand that the connection between the 2 households had been found, that the single net had been seen whole. You see, the difficulty with Mr. Ferris's scheme was never the forging. He forges beautifully. The difficulty was that a forged signature is worthless unless a respectable man will swear it true, and a respectable man will not swear a stranger's crime unless he is part of it. So the whole edifice rested on 2 names sworn again and again across 100 papers. A magistrate and a family's man of business. Bought, both of them, and bound to the fraud by their own oaths. She set the paper down. "I have 40 such papers, Mr. Crewe. 40, each bearing your name as witness to a signature you knew to be false. That is not a duke's madness. That is 40 counts of conspiracy in your own hand, which is why you dared not write your own hand just now for me to set beside them." The great hall had gone utterly silent. Ferris's agreeable face had lost its color, and the magistrate, the man who had come to judge, took 1 step backward toward the door, and the step was a confession louder than any word. "It is her word," Ferris tried, but his smooth voice had cracked. "Her word against ours. A cast-out girl and a burned recluse against a magistrate and a lady of the county. No court will." "No court needs to take my word," said the Duke of Wrenhaven, and he spoke for the first time. and his low voice filled the hall like the toll of a bell. "Because I have not been idle these past weeks either, Ferris, while my wife built her proofs. I have written to the Lord Lieutenant of the county, who is my cousin, and to the King's Bench in London, and I have sent them copies, true certified copies, of every one of those 40 papers, with my wife's analysis appended, and hers is not the only name upon that analysis. I engaged, at no small cost, the finest examiner of documents in England, a man who has hanged forgers for the crown, and he has reviewed her work, and he has set his name beside hers, and he agrees with every word." He let the silence stretch. "The proofs are already in London, gentlemen. They left this house 2 days ago. You did not come today to a hall where the matter might still be hidden. You came to a hall where it is already too late. I simply wished you to know it to your faces, in my house on this day of all days, which you chose so cruelly, believing it would break me. It has not broken me. My wife would not permit it." Lady Vane made a small sound. She had gone grey beneath the powder. "Sidonie," she said, and her voice had lost all its iron. "Sidonie, we are your family. Whatever is between us, blood is blood. You would not see your own aunt in the dock, your cousins ruined, for the sake of an old quarrel." Sidonie looked at the woman who had thrown her into the snow with 2 guineas and no breakfast, who had called her mad to a whole county, who had tried to recruit her into her own destruction, and she felt, waiting for her, the old ungovernable heat, the rage of 11 silent years, and she found that she did not want it any more. She had something better now than rage. "You are not being ruined for an old quarrel, Aunt," she said, and her voice was quiet and terribly steady. "You are being ruined for 40 counts of forgery, conspiracy, and the attempted destruction of a peer of this realm. I did not do that to you. You did it to yourselves over a year of patient greed, and you would have done it to my husband and slept soundly. I am not your ruin. I am merely the one person in the north who could read your hand." She lifted her chin. "You threw me out because I had too much spirit. It seems in the end that you should have been far more afraid of my eyes." There was nothing after that. Bartholomew Crewe turned and walked from the hall without a word, an old man suddenly, his office worthless in his pocket. Ferris tried once more to speak, and found there was nothing left to say that would not hang him faster, and he followed. And Lady Vane, magnificent no longer, gathered her frightened daughters and went out into the winter, and the great door of Wrenhaven Hall boomed shut behind the whole ruinous procession and did not open again. Sidonie stood in the ringing quiet, and found that her hands were shaking and did not trouble this time to hide it. The house was very still that evening. The enemy was gone, riding home to await the summons from London that would surely come, and the war that had shaped both their lives was, for all purposes, won. And Sidonie sat alone before the fire in the small warm parlour that had become, over the strange weeks of her marriage, the nearest thing to her own, and she was not, as she had expected to be, triumphant. She was afraid. She was afraid because the war was over, and the war had been the reason. He had needed a wife for the fighting of it, and for the getting of an heir, and the fighting was done now, and she let the cold logic of it work through her the way she let all logic work, all the way to the bottom. The contract had been a transaction. The transaction was complete. And a woman who has completed her use has no claim on anything but her wages, and Sidonie had insisted, at the very first, that her wages be her own and never taken from her. And she understood now, sitting alone, that she had built herself that protection because some part of her had always known this hour would come. The hour when she would have to learn what she was to him once she was no longer needed. She did not hear him come in. She only felt him, the way one feels a fire built up behind one, and then he was lowering himself into the chair across from her, his ruined hand curled in his lap, and his grey eyes on her face. "You are thinking," said Evander Cade, "something cold and logical and entirely wrong, and I can see you doing it because your face goes very still when you are proving to yourself that you are alone. I have watched you do it a dozen times. Tell me what the sum is." "The war is over," said Sidonie. She would not lie to him. She had never lied to him. It was the one thing that had been true between them from the first freezing hour. You needed a wife to fight it. It is fought. I am, as of this evening, a tool that has done its work." She kept her voice even, because evenness was the last armor she owned. "I insisted my wages be my own. I will hold you to that and no more. You need not fear I will cling. I have been unwanted before. I know how to do it quietly." For a long moment Evander said nothing at all, and then he did something she had never once seen him do. He rose from his chair and he crossed to her, and he knelt, slowly, deliberately, every proud, stiff line of him protesting, a proud man lowering himself to the floor before a woman, when both of them knew that kneeling to anyone at all was, for him, an act of near violence against his own nature. "Get up," said Sidoni, alarmed. "Evander, you do not kneel to me. Get up, you must not." "No," he said. "I did not kneel at the inn when I offered you a contract, because a contract is a thing men do standing, a matter of business, and I hid behind that, as I have hidden behind everything for 4 years. So I will kneel now. Once. Badly. Because this is not business, and I am done pretending it is." He took her hand, her ink-stained clever hand, in his good one. "I did not carry that contract through the sleet because I needed a forger. I told myself I did. I am a very great liar, Sidoni, but only ever to myself. I had heard of you before that dinner. The whole county had heard of the vain niece with the tongue that would not be governed, and I, who had governed my whole heart into silence for 4 years, I wanted, God help me, to see her. And then I saw you stand up at that table and set fire to a room full of people you needed, for no reason on earth but that a thing was true, and you could not bear to let it stand as a lie. And I thought—" His voice roughened. "I thought, there is a person who is still alive, when I have been dead these 4 years, and only pretending. And I signed that contract before I ever reached the inn, with a blank where your name should go, because I could not admit even to myself that I had already decided, that I was not recruiting a soldier but proposing to a woman that I had wanted something at last, and the something was you." Sidoni could not speak. The fire cracked. His hand was warm around hers. "The war is over," he said. "You are right. And I find I do not care about the war at all now that it is done, except that it brought you up my avenue in the frost. Stay because the war is over, Sidoni. Stay because there is no longer any reason for you to stay, and you stay anyway. That is the only kind of staying I would believe. I cannot offer you the thing I offered at the inn, protection and a name and a use, because you have outgrown all of it. You do not need my protection. You dismantled a magistrate this afternoon. You do not need my name for its weight. You have made it heavier than I ever did. There is nothing left for me to give you but the one thing I swore 4 years ago I would never give anyone again. Because giving it is how you come to stand at a burning door you cannot open." He drew a breath. "I love you. It is a foolish thing to build a life on, and a fragile one. And I have the scars to prove exactly how fragile, and I am offering it to you anyway, with a ruined hand, because you have taught me these weeks that a coward is only a person who has dressed his wanting up as strategy, and I am tired, Sidoni, of fighting badly." And Sidoni, who had made her heart a ledger, who had spent 11 years wanting nothing because wanting was the surest road to ruin, looked at the burned, proud man kneeling before her fire, offering her the one thing that could not be written into any contract, and she felt the last stone of her own fortress come loose and fall. "I wrote my name in that blank," she said, and her voice shook, and she let it. "And I told myself it was strategy, and it was the truest lie I ever told. Get up, Evander. Get up off that cold floor before you do yourself a mischief, and I have to audit the physician's bill." She was laughing and weeping at once, which she had not done since she was a child, since before her father's disgrace, since before she learned that feeling was a thing the world would use against her. "Get up and kiss me, you great foolish coward, and let us both for once in our lives be brave about the same thing at the same time." He got up. It cost him, and he did it, and he pulled her out of the chair and against his chest, his good hand splayed warm across her back and his ruined one, the one that would not open, pressed as best it could to her waist, and he kissed her before the fire in the small, warm parlour of a house that had known nothing but grief for 4 years, and the grief, in that moment, let go its long hold and let something else come in. They were married already, in law. But they were not truly wed, Sidonie always thought afterward, until that evening by the fire, when two people who had each turned their whole hearts into fortresses agreed at last to leave the gates open. Spring came late to Wrenhaven that year, but it came. The 40 papers did their work in London, and Ambrose Ferris and Bartholomew Crewe were both tried and both broken. And Lady Vane, though the law could not quite reach her through her husband's careful distance, was broken in the only way that had ever mattered to her, which was that the county learned everything and would not receive her. And she moved at last to a small house in a small town where no one had heard the name of Wrenhaven, and there, one presumes, she was very dull and very quiet, and got no gratitude from anyone at all. On a bright morning in May, Sidonie sat at the great oak table in the muniment room, which was hers entirely now, going over the spring accounts. And Evander came in from the fields with mud on his boots, and the winter gone from his face, and he leaned his hip against the table and looked down at his wife, and his ruined hand, she noticed, rested easy now at his side, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. "Are you examining my hand again, Your Grace?" he asked, for it had become a joke between them, that she could not stop reading every hand that came before her. "Always," said Sidonie. "It is the only honest signature I trust in all the world. It cannot be forged, you see. No one else on earth could copy it. It is the truest thing I own." She thought sometimes of the girl in the grey silk gown, cast out in the frost with 2 guineas and no breakfast, thrown away by a family who had decided she was too loud, too clever, and too full of some ungovernable fire to be permitted a warm place in the world. They had meant it as her ending, a slow disappearance into obscurity, a cautionary tale for timid women. Too much spirit, they had said, as though spirit were a fault, as though a woman burned brightest only so that she might be more easily put out. But the fire they had cast her into the cold for was the very thing that had read a forged hand at 40 paces, that had stood up in a lion's den and stared down a magistrate that had taught a burned and grieving man to want the world again. They had thrown her away for having too much spirit. And her spirit had walked her straight into the one house in England where it was not a fault to be punished but a light to be treasured. She quite liked, in the end, what they had made of her by throwing her away. "The numbers can wait," said Evander, and plucked the pen from her fingers and drew her up out of the chair and into the May morning light. And Sidonie Lark, Duchess of Wrenhaven, who had been cast out for having too much spirit and had answered a marriage contract with her whole guarded heart, let the ledger lie and went.